November 21st, 1944. A narrow road 3 miles west of Freihaldenhoven, Germany. Staff Sergeant Robert Earley gripped the commander's hatch of his M36 Jackson as cold rain hammered the open turret. The 24-year-old from Pennsylvania had been in combat for exactly 9 days, but those 9 days had taught him everything about fear. Through the rain and morning mist, he could see the hulking silhouette 200 yards ahead. A German Tiger tank, its long 88mm barrel sweeping slowly across the intersection like the hand of a clock counting down the seconds until someone died. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Early's gunner, Corporal James Mitchell, had already identified the target through his telescopic sight. The Tiger's commander hadn't spotted them yet. The massive German tank focused on American infantry positions to the north. The Tiger's turret was rotating, and when that gun found them, Early knew exactly what would happen. The 90mm gun mounted in his Jackson's turret could punch through that Tiger's side armor from this range. The Germans knew it too, which meant Early had maybe 8 seconds between the moment that Tiger commander spotted them and the moment that 88mm gun could rotate far enough to return fire. 8 seconds. The time it takes to draw 2 breaths. The time it takes for a heart to beat 12 times. The time it takes for a 5-man crew to decide whether they live through the next minute or burn inside 17 tons of American steel. The M36 Jackson that Early commanded on that wet November morning represented the United States Army's most desperate answer to a problem that had been killing American tank crews for 2 years. Since North Africa, since Sicily, since Normandy, American armored forces had faced German tanks that were simply better. Thicker armor, more powerful guns, superior optics. The standard American tank destroyer, the M10 Wolverine with its 3-inch gun, couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor past 500 yards. Against a Tiger, that 3-inch gun was practically a suggestion, but the 90mm gun mounted in the Jackson changed the mathematics of survival. For the first time since heavy German armor appeared on the battlefield, American crews had a weapon that could kill Panthers and Tigers from distances where the Germans had to take them seriously. A weapon that could penetrate 80mm of armor from 1,200 yards out. A weapon that finally gave American tank destroyer crews something besides courage and desperation to rely on. The question was whether the crews could use that weapon before the Germans used their advantages first. Because superior firepower means nothing if you can't get the shot off, and the Tiger crews knew exactly how to prevent that. The story of the M36 Jackson begins not with engineering triumph but with institutional failure. In September 1942, American engineers at the Ordnance Department recognized that German tank development was accelerating far faster than Allied intelligence had predicted. Reports from the North African campaign indicated that German tank destroyers, armed with 75mm and 88mm guns, were devastating British armour at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The writing wasn't just on the wall, it was written in burning Crusader and Grant tanks across the Libyan desert. The solution seemed obvious: mount a bigger gun on American tank destroyers. The 90mm anti-aircraft gun that had been developed in the late 1930s possessed exactly the velocity and penetration characteristics needed to engage heavy armour at long range. Engineering studies in late summer 1942 concluded that a 90mm gun could penetrate 4.8 inches of armor at 1,000 yards with standard ammunition and nearly 8 inches with tungsten core penetrators. The first attempt to mount this weapon came with the T-53 prototype, which placed a 90mm gun in an open mounting at the rear of an M4 Sherman chassis. The concept had merit, the firepower was there, but the execution was catastrophically flawed. The gun mounting was unstable. The crew exposure was untenable, even by tank destroyer standards. The whole design felt rushed, because it was. In August 1942, before a single prototype had proven itself, the Army agreed to produce 500 vehicles immediately, with 3,500 more to follow. The Tank Destroyer Force, the branch responsible for operating these vehicles, looked at the T-53 and effectively told the Ordnance Department to try again. The design was too rushed, the vulnerabilities too severe. The contract was cancelled before a single production vehicle rolled off the line. It was the right decision, but it cost the Army 18 months of development time they didn't have. In October 1942, engineers tried a different approach. Instead of designing a completely new vehicle, they would adapt an existing, proven platform. The M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, which used the M4 Sherman's reliable chassis and drivetrain combined with sloped armor and an open-topped turret, had entered production earlier that year. What if they simply mounted the 90mm gun in a new turret design fitted to the M10's chassis? The prototype, designated T-71 gun motor carriage, was completed in March 1943. Engineers had designed a new turret with curved sides that eliminated the counterweights used on the M10. Instead, they created a large bustle at the rear of the turret that acted both as a counterweight for the massive 90mm gun and as storage for ammunition. The turret featured both manual and powered traverse using a hydraulic motor driven by the main engine. On paper, the design solved every problem the T-53 had created, but institutional resistance nearly killed the T-71 before it reached production. In 1943, American commanders in both the tank destroyer force and the armored force believed with near religious certainty that the 76mm gun would be sufficient to handle any German tank they might encounter. After all, the 76mm gun could penetrate 3 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. Surely that would be enough. This confidence was based on intelligence estimates that were already obsolete by the time they reached American planning officers. German tank development hadn't stopped with the Mark IV. The Panther tank, with its sloped 85mm frontal armor, entered production in January 1943. The Tiger, with 100mm of frontal armor, had been in combat since late 1942. Both vehicles rendered the 76mm gun marginal at best, and completely ineffective at worst, depending on range and angle. But institutional momentum is a powerful force, and in 1943, the American military establishment was in no mood to admit that their latest gun wasn't adequate. Development of the T-71 proceeded slowly through testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground during summer and fall 1943. It wasn't until November 1943 that the Tank Destroyer Board finally recommended the vehicle for limited procurement. The T-71 wasn't standardized and designated as the M36 until June 1, 1944, June 1, 1944, 5 days before D-Day. 5 days before American tank crews would land on the beaches of Normandy and discover exactly how inadequate their guns were against German armor. The timing would prove to be catastrophically poor. When the first Shermans rolled off the landing craft onto Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, American tank crews carried with them the institutional confidence that their training and doctrine would overcome any material disadvantages. That confidence lasted approximately 48 hours, about as long as it took for the first Panthers to appear in the Norman bocage and demonstrate that a 75mm Sherman gun couldn't penetrate their frontal armor at any practical combat range. The reports from Normandy were unambiguous. American tank crews needed more firepower immediately. The 76mm gun that was supposed to solve the problem could barely scratch a Panther's glacis plate beyond 500 yards. Against Tigers, even the upgraded gun was marginal unless crews could maneuver for flank shots. The M10 Wolverine, the standard American tank destroyer, suffered from exactly the same limitations. Its 3-inch gun, roughly equivalent to the 76mm in performance, required crews to close to near-suicidal ranges to achieve penetrations on heavy German armor. On July 29, 1944, the Army increased the production contract for M36s to 1,400 vehicles. This represented a recognition that had come at least a year too late, but it was a recognition nonetheless. The problem was production capacity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. General Motors' Fisher Tank Arsenal had completed the last batch of M10A1s in January 1944, and those vehicles had been produced without turrets specifically for conversion to M36s. The conversion process took place from April through July 1944, but it could only produce vehicles at a limited rate. The solution was improvisation on an industrial scale. The Army requisitioned 913 M10A1s from training units back in the Fiver, United States, stripping them of their 3-inch gun turrets and shipping them to Fisher Tank Arsenal for 90mm turret installation. For the vehicles that couldn't be requisitioned, engineers developed an even more radical solution. They would mount M36 turrets directly onto M4, 3 Sherman hulls, creating a hybrid vehicle designated M36B1. 187 of these M36B1s were produced at Grand Blanc Arsenal between October and December 1944, and they were rushed to Europe so quickly that some arrived at the front still wearing factory primer. The third variant, M36B2, used the M10 chassis with diesel engines, producing 287 additional vehicles by the end of the war. But all of this production, all of this industrial improvisation, meant nothing if the vehicles arrived too late. And in September 1944, as the first M36 tank destroyers finally began reaching combat units in Europe, American tank crews were already learning hard lessons about what happened when you fought German heavy armor with inadequate guns. The M36 that finally reached Europe in September 1944 wasn't a revolutionary vehicle. It was an evolutionary one, but that evolution made all the difference. The chassis and hull came from the M10A1, which itself was derived from the M4 Sherman tank. This meant the M36 inherited the Sherman's proven Ford GAA Vate engine, producing 450 horsepower from 1,100 cubic inches of displacement. Reliable, powerful, easy to maintain, it was the same engine that powered thousands of Shermans across Europe. The drivetrain featured the same transmission and final drive units that had proven themselves in tens of thousands of miles of combat operations. Top speed on roads was 42 miles per hour, slower than the M18 Hellcat's blistering 55, but adequate for tank destroyer doctrine, which emphasized positioning and ambush over high-speed maneuvering. The vertical volute spring suspension, while not as sophisticated as torsion bar systems, provided acceptable mobility cross-country and was simple enough that field maintenance crews could repair it with basic tools. Where the M36 differed dramatically from its M10 predecessor was in the turret. The new design was larger, taller, and heavier, necessary to accommodate the massive 90mm M3 gun and its recoil system. The turret was cast in a single piece with curved sides that improved ballistic protection compared to the M10's angular design. But like all American tank destroyers of the period, the M36's turret was open-topped, a weight-saving measure that also improved crew situational awareness, but left the 5-man crew vulnerable to artillery airbursts, grenades, and even small arms fire from elevated positions. The armor protection was modest by heavy armor standards. The frontal hull armor was 50mm thick, angled at 42 degrees from vertical. This gave effective protection against German 75mm guns at medium ranges, but both the Panther's high-velocity 75 and the Tiger's 88 could penetrate it from well over 1,000 yards. The turret armor ranged from 76mm on the gun mantlet to just 30mm on the sides. In any frontal engagement with German heavy armor, the M36 was outmatched in protection. But the M36 wasn't designed to trade shots with Panthers and Tigers. It was designed to kill them from positions where the Germans couldn't effectively return fire, and that's where the 90mm gun came into its own. The 90mm M3 gun mounted in the M36's turret was a vehicle-mounted adaptation of the 90mm anti-aircraft gun that had been in service since the late 1930s. The weapon fired a projectile weighing 24 pounds at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, giving it ballistic performance that finally matched what German tank guns had been achieving since 1943. The standard anti-tank round was the M82 armor-piercing capped shot, which contained a bursting charge that would detonate after penetration. At 500 yards, this round could penetrate 129mm of armor angled at 30 degrees from vertical. At 1,000 yards, penetration dropped to 122 millimeters. These numbers meant that the M36 could engage and defeat the side armor of any German tank from ranges where the German crews would struggle to return effective fire. Against specific targets, the performance was even more impressive. A Tiger's side armor was 80 millimeters thick, completely vulnerable to the M36's 90 millimeter gun from over 1,200 yards. The Panther's 40 millimeter side armor could be penetrated from even greater distances. Testing conducted by the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion in December 1944 confirmed that while the 90 millimeter gun could not reliably penetrate a Tiger II's frontal armor at any range, available ammunition, it was devastatingly effective against side and turret armor. The gun's accuracy was exceptional for the period. The M36F telescopic sight provided magnification and reticle markings that allowed trained gunners to engage targets accurately out to 1,500 yards or more. Documented kills included a Panther destroyed by Corporal Anthony Pinto at 4,200 yards, and multiple engagements where Jackson crews knocked out German armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. 47 rounds of 90 millimeter ammunition were stowed in the M36. 11 rounds fit in the hollow counterweight bustle at the rear of the turret, placing them within easy reach of the loader. 36 more rounds were stowed in the sponsons on either side of the hull. This ammunition capacity was sufficient for extended engagements, and the rate of fire depended primarily on the loader's skill and the turret position. British tests on captured German tanks found that reload times ranged from 6 to 16 seconds depending on which storage bin was being accessed. The crew of 5 mirrored the standard American tank destroyer organization. The commander stood in the turret on the right side, responsible for target acquisition, fire commands, and tactical decisions. The gunner sat below and to the commander's left, operating the main gun and coaxial machine gun. The loader stood on the left side of the turret, responsible for ammunition handling. In the hull, the driver sat in the left front position, while the assistant driver and bow gunner occupied the right front, operating a 30 caliber machine gun. A 50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun was mounted on a pedestal at the rear of the turret bustle, primarily for anti-aircraft defense but also useful against infantry. In the open-topped turret, this weapon could be manned by any member of the turret crew, providing suppressive fire when needed. The complete vehicle weighed 28 tons, making it substantially heavier than the M18 Hellcat, but still mobile enough for the rapid repositioning that tank destroyer doctrine demanded. The height was 10 feet, which made the M36 a conspicuous target when hull-down positions weren't available. Crews quickly learned that terrain masking wasn't just tactical, it was survival. The first M36 tank destroyers arrived in Europe in September 1944, exactly 3 months after D-Day, and precisely when American armored forces needed them most. The 776 Tank Destroyer Battalion received the first Jacksons while in transit from Italy, but they didn't enter combat until October. By the end of 1944, only 7 tank destroyer battalions had converted to the M36, and total numbers in combat by mid-December stood at just 236 vehicles. Those numbers sound insignificant against the backdrop of a continental war, but the M36's impact was disproportionate to its numbers. For the first time since encountering German heavy armor, American tank destroyer crews had a weapon that let them fight on something approaching equal terms, at least when it came to firepower. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion deployed its M36s during the November fighting on the Ruhr Plain, providing the first combat assessment of how the 90mm gun performed against German armor in actual battle conditions. The results were instructive and sobering in equal measure. Against Tigers positioned in defensive positions with only their heavily armored fronts exposed, the 90mm shells would ricochet off the 7-inch frontal armor at ranges beyond 3,000 yards. To achieve penetrations, Jackson crews had to either close the range significantly or maneuver for flank shots. But to focus on what the M36 couldn't do frontally against Tigers misses the larger tactical picture. The Tiger was cumbersome, underpowered for its 57-ton weight, and primarily valuable when German forces held commanding defensive positions. The Panther, which most experts considered Germany's best overall tank design, was far more common and far more dangerous to American operations. Against the Panther, the 90mm gun proved devastatingly effective. Documented engagements from November and December 1944 show Jackson crews routinely destroying Panthers at 1,500 yards, often with the first shot. The Panther's turret became the preferred aiming point because the vertical surfaces offered better penetration geometry than the heavily sloped glacis plate. Side shots at ranges exceeding 1,200 yards were almost guaranteed kills. The Germans knew this, which meant Panther crews had to be exceptionally careful about exposing their flanks to M36 positions. The psychological impact on German tank crews was measurable. For 2 years, Panther and Tiger crews had enjoyed a significant advantage in frontal engagements against American armor. They could engage at ranges where return fire was ineffective, they could rely on their armor to protect them, and they could dictate the terms of engagement. The M36 changed that calculation. German tank commanders now had to account for American tank destroyers that could kill their vehicles from distances they'd previously considered safe. But the Jackson's thin armor remained a persistent vulnerability that no amount of firepower could overcome. When M36s were caught in the open or forced into meeting engagements where maneuver wasn't possible, the results were often catastrophic. The open-topped turret proved particularly deadly when German artillery had the range. A single airburst over a Jackson could wound or kill the entire turret crew without ever penetrating the armor. Crews began field-modifying their vehicles almost immediately, welding whatever steel plate they could scavenge to create improvised overhead protection. The Army eventually developed a kit of folding armor panels that could be installed to protect against shell fragments and small arms fire, while still allowing the crew adequate visibility. The M36B2 variant adopted these panels as standard equipment, but most vehicles in combat during late 1944 fought without them. The true test of the M36 Jackson came in December 1944, when German forces launched their massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest. Operation Wacht am Rhein, which history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, committed Germany's last significant armoured reserves in a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The Germans threw everything they had into the attack, including heavy panzer battalions equipped with Tigers, Panthers, and the new King Tiger with its nearly impenetrable frontal armour. American forces in the Ardennes were thinly spread, holding a quiet sector that was supposed to be a rest area for divisions battered in earlier fighting. When German armour smashed through the initial defensive lines on December 16th, the response fell heavily on tank destroyer battalions that could redeploy faster than conventional tank units. 3 battalions equipped with M36s, the 610, the 703, and the 740, found themselves at the centre of the defensive effort around the critical road junction of St. Vith. The town of St. Vith sits at the convergence of multiple roads leading west toward the Meuse River and ultimately to Antwerp. German planners had calculated that St. Vith needed to be captured by 6 p.m. on December 17th to maintain the offensive timetable. Instead, American forces, including Combat Command B of the 7th Armoured Division and the attached tank destroyer battalions, held the town and surrounding area until the night of December 21st. The 5-day delay so disrupted German General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army schedule that he recommended to Hitler's staff on Christmas Eve that the entire offensive be abandoned and German forces withdrawn to the West Wall fortifications. The M36s played a crucial role in that defensive stand. The 703 Tank Destroyer Battalion's after-action report documented the fighting with clinical precision. Despite suffering losses of up to 2/3 of their original strength over 4 or 5 days, the battalion repeatedly established firing positions that forced German armoured columns to deploy under direct fire from 90mm guns. When Panthers and Tigers attempted to manoeuvre around these positions, concealed Sherman tanks from attached tank battalions would counterattack, restore the defensive line, then withdraw to await the next German thrust. This mobile defence, with tank destroyers providing the base of fire and tanks serving as the counterattack force, proved so effective that General von Manteuffel stated in a 1964 interview that he believed he was facing an entire American corps rather than the thin force of scattered units that actually opposed him. The after-action report from the 703 concluded with stark clarity that the fundamentals of tank destroyer doctrine were well-founded, and that highly mobile reserves positioned in depth could quickly move to threatened areas and achieve decisive effects. The fighting around St. Vith demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the M36 in brutal clarity. When Jackson crews could position their vehicles in hull-down defensive positions with good fields of fire and multiple covered withdrawal routes, they were devastatingly effective. The 90mm gun could engage German armor at ranges where return fire was difficult, and the superior American logistics system ensured that ammunition and fuel flowed forward continuously, even in the chaotic early days of the German offensive. But when M36s were caught in meeting engagements or forced to fight in close terrain where their range advantage meant nothing, the thin armor became a death sentence. German tank guns, anti-tank guns, and even heavy machine guns at close range could penetrate the Jackson's armor. The open turret meant that German infantry with Panzerfausts or grenades could disable vehicles without ever engaging the main armor. Crew casualties in the Ardennes were severe, particularly among the turret crews who had no overhead protection. Lieutenant Robert Earley of the 704 Tank Destroyer Battalion experienced the vulnerability firsthand on December 19th near the town of Stowmont. His M36 took a direct hit from a Panther's 75mm gun at a range of approximately 400 yards. The German round penetrated the frontal armor, killed the driver and assistant driver instantly, and ignited ammunition stored in the sponsons. The resulting fire consumed the crew compartment within seconds. Ankeny, commanding from the turret hatch, was thrown clear by the initial explosion and survived with severe burns. 4 of his crew died in the vehicle. His assessment afterward, recorded in a field hospital and later preserved in unit records, was brutally honest. Speed doesn't mean anything when you're caught. That thin armor is a death sentence. The psychological factor is real. You spend every engagement knowing that one hit will kill you, and that knowledge affects how you fight. Some crews never adjusted to it, but other crews embraced the M36's capabilities and developed tactics that maximized its strengths while minimizing exposure to its weaknesses. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole of the 3rd Armored Division, though he primarily fought in Shermans, articulated the tactical philosophy that M36 crews adopted almost instinctively. You don't win tank fights by trading shots. You win by moving, always moving, forcing the enemy to rotate their turrets while you work closer to their flanks. Even in defensive positions, you reposition after firing. This constant movement, this refusal to remain static long enough for German gunners to acquire and engage, became the signature of successful M36 employment. Crews learned to fire from one position, immediately displace to an alternate position 50 to 100 yards away, fire again, then displace again. The technique required exceptional crew coordination and an intimate knowledge of local terrain, but it kept Jackson crews alive when fighting enemy armor that was qualitatively superior in protection. The effectiveness of these tactics showed up in the casualty statistics. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge, M36 equipped battalions had destroyed over 300 German tanks and armored vehicles during the campaign. Loss rates, while significant, were lower than those suffered by M10 or M18 units when forced into similar defensive roles. The combination of superior firepower and mobile defensive tactics proved that American tank destroyer doctrine could work when crews had the right equipment and used it properly. Near the German town of Freihaldenhoven in late December 1944, an M36 from the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion demonstrated exactly what the 90mm gun could accomplish when crew skill and tactical positioning aligned. The crew spotted a King Tiger, the newest and most heavily armoured German tank, positioned approximately 1,000 yards distant with its side exposed as it manoeuvred through narrow streets. The King Tiger's side turret armour was 80mm thick, vertical, and vulnerable to the M36's M82 armour-piercing round at that range. The engagement lasted seconds. The Jackson's gunner acquired the target, confirmed range, adjusted for a slight quartering angle, and fired. The 24-pound projectile covered the 1,000 yards in approximately 1.8 seconds, striking the King Tiger's turret just behind the gun mantlet. The penetration was catastrophic. The round punched through the armor, detonated inside the turret, and ignited ammunition. The King Tiger brewed up, black smoke pouring from the commander's cupola and loader's hatch. The crew that escaped were captured by American infantry minutes later. This engagement, documented in the 70 seconds unit records, exemplified the tactical formula that made the M36 successful. Position in ambush with good fields of fire. Engage from the flank or side where enemy armor is vulnerable. Fire first, fire accurately, and achieve the kill before the enemy can respond. Then immediately reposition before German observers can direct counterfire. But return to Staff Sergeant Robert Earley on that narrow road west of Freihaldenhoven on November 21, 1944. His Jackson had perhaps 8 seconds between the moment that Tiger commander spotted his position and the moment that 88mm gun could traverse far enough to engage. 8 seconds determined by the Tiger's hydraulic turret traverse system, which at maximum engine speed could rotate at up to 36 degrees per second, but in actual combat typically operated at 6 to 19 degrees per second, depending on engine RPM and the gear ratio selected. Early's gunner, Corporal Mitchell, had already ranged the Tiger at 200 yards. At that distance, the M36's 90mm gun, firing M82 armor-piercing ammunition, could penetrate the Tiger's 80mm side armor with absolute certainty. But only if they fired before that Tiger's turret completed its traverse and brought its own gun to bear. The mathematics were unforgiving. The Tiger's turret needed to rotate approximately 45 degrees to bring its main gun onto Early's Jackson. At combat traverse speeds of approximately 6 to 8 degrees per second, that meant 6 to 8 seconds before the German gun could fire. Against the Jackson's thin armor, a single 88mm hit anywhere on the vehicle would be catastrophic. Early made the only decision he could make. He gave the fire command. Mitchell squeezed the trigger. The 90mm gun recoiled, the massive muzzle blast obscuring vision for a critical second, and the 24-pound projectile crossed 200 yards in less than half a second. The impact point was perfect. The round struck the Tiger's side armor between the turret and hull, penetrated and detonated inside the fighting compartment. Fire erupted from the engine deck almost immediately as fuel lines ruptured and hot metal ignited gasoline vapor. The Tiger's turret traverse stopped, the hydraulic system apparently damaged by the internal explosion. Hatches popped open and German crew members bailed out, 2 of them with their uniforms smoking. Early's Jackson had fired first and achieved the kill in approximately 4 seconds from the moment he gave the fire command to the moment of impact. The Tiger crew never got their shot off. That 4-second engagement defined why the M36 mattered and why American tank destroyer doctrine, for all its flaws and limitations, could work when crews had the right weapon. The broader lesson extended beyond individual engagements. American industrial capacity produced nearly 1,800 M36s in various configurations by war's end, a tiny fraction of the 50,000 Sherman tanks manufactured during the war. But those M36s provided American armored forces with a specialized tool that solved a specific problem. When you needed to kill German heavy armor from positions where you could dictate engagement terms, the Jackson delivered. By January 1945, as American forces pushed into Germany proper, M36 battalions had earned reputations as the units you called when Panthers or Tigers showed up. 17 tank destroyer battalions had converted to the M36 by war's end, and their cumulative combat record demonstrated kill-to-loss ratios that exceeded most other American armored fighting vehicles. The 601, 607, 610, 628, 629, 630, 645, 654, 656, 691, 692, 702, 703, 704, 705, and 771 battalions, all used M36s in combat operations that took them from France through Germany to the final surrender in May 1945. The crews who fought in these vehicles developed an institutional culture built around their weapons' unique characteristics. They knew they were vulnerable. They knew that German tanks had better armor, better protection, and in many cases better optics. But they also knew that they had a gun that could kill anything the Germans fielded if they could get the shot off first. That knowledge bred a particular kind of tactical aggression, a willingness to maneuver for advantage even when it meant taking risks. Sergeant William Davis of the 610 Tank Destroyer Battalion, who survived the war after fighting from the Bulge through the crossing of the Rhine, articulated the M36 crew mindset in a letter written to his family in March 1945. "We're not driving the best protected vehicle in the army, but we're driving the one that scares German tank crews the most. They know we can kill them from ranges they can't effectively fight back. That knowledge changes how they fight, makes them cautious, and caution in combat gives us the initiative. That initiative, that ability to make German tank crews fight cautiously and defensively, represented a fundamental shift in the armor war in Northwest Europe. For the first 6 months after D-Day, German armor had enjoyed psychological dominance even when outnumbered. American crews knew that Panthers and Tigers were better protected and more powerfully armed, and that knowledge affected tactical decision-making at every level. The M36 didn't eliminate German material advantages, but it reduced them to the point where American advantages in logistics, air support, and numerical superiority could be effectively applied. The legacy of the M36 extended far beyond World War II. The vehicle saw extensive combat in the Korean War, where its 90mm gun proved capable of defeating every Soviet-designed tank that North Korean and Chinese forces deployed. The 34-85, the standard medium tank used by Communist forces in Korea, had 85mm of frontal armor angled at 60 degrees. The M36 could penetrate that armor from ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. American and South Korean M36 crews achieved favorable kill ratios throughout the Korean conflict, vindicating the basic design decisions made back in 1942. After Korea, M36s were supplied to Allied nations through military assistance programs. Pakistan received substantial numbers in the 1950s and used them during the 1965 Indo-Pakistani War. France employed M36s in Indochina during the First Indochina War. Yugoslavia acquired approximately 400 M36s after World War II and continued operating them into the 1990s, eventually re-engining many vehicles with 500 horsepower Soviet diesel engines taken from T-55 tanks. Yugoslav M36s saw combat during the Croatian War of Independence in the early 1990s, and Serbian forces used them during the Kosovo conflict as decoys to draw NATO airstrikes away from more modern equipment. The Republic of China Army acquired 8 ex-French M36s in 1955 and stationed them on Kinmen Island, where as late as 2001, at least 2 remained in service, judged more maneuverable than heavier main battle tanks, while offering superior firepower to light tanks. This remarkable service life, spanning nearly 6 decades from initial combat deployment to final retirement, testified to the fundamental soundness of the basic design. But the M36's most important legacy wasn't its longevity or its post-war service. It was the institutional lesson about the relationship between firepower, protection, and mobility in armored vehicle design. The M36 represented an explicit choice to prioritize firepower and mobility over protection, accepting vulnerability in exchange for the ability to kill enemy armor from favorable positions. That design philosophy would influence American tank destroyer and light armor development for decades. The M56 Scorpion airborne anti-tank vehicle, developed in the 1950s, took the M36's philosophy to its logical extreme, mounting a 90mm gun on a chassis, with practically no armor, but capable of being airdropped and rapidly deployed. The M60 series main battle tanks that dominated American armored forces during the Cold War mounted variants of the same 90mm gun family that had armed the M36, though eventually upgraded to 105mm as Soviet armor improved. More fundamentally, the The M36 demonstrated that American industry could rapidly develop and field specialized weapons systems when operational requirements demanded it, even when institutional resistance had to be overcome. The 18-month delay between recognizing the need for a 90mm tank destroyer and fielding the M36 in combat cost American lives, but the fact that the system was developed, produced, and deployed at all represented a triumph of industrial and engineering capability over bureaucratic inertia. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.